Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Earth Climate Dreams, Depth Psychological Reflections in the Age of the Anthropocene. And I'm really excited to continue this series with Dr. Stephen Aizenstat, who's the Chancellor and Founding President of Pacifica Graduate Institute. Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, I'm really happy to be able to spend the next few minutes with you and to really be able to garner some of your insights into what has been a long career for you in the field of depth psychology, but particularly with such an emphasis on dreams and also dreams and the earth. So we'll dig more into that. Let me just first read your bio, Steve, so that everybody has some background on you for those who are not as familiar, and then we'll jump right into the conversation.
Okay, sounds wonderful.
Great. So Stephen Aizenstat, as I mentioned, is the Chancellor and Founding President of Pacifica, and he's a professor of depth psychology with a PhD in clinical psychology, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and a credentialed public schools teacher and counselor. Dr. Aizenstat lectures and consults internationally, particularly with global corporations, and is affiliated with the Earth Charter International Project through the United Nations. Dr. Aizenstat's book, Dream Tending, describes applications of dream work in relation to health and healing, nightmares, the world's dream, relationships, and the creative process. His methodologies extend traditional dream work to the vision of an animated world where living images in dream are experienced as embodied and originating in the psyche of nature as well as that of persons. And Dr. Aizenstat has numerous publications, which you can read in his biography here, and his major work, Dream Tending, also recently was translated into Italian. So Steve, again, I mean, this is such an amazing body of work because it is such a unique approach to looking at both dreams and also the relationship with the earth, as I mentioned, and I really want to spend the bulk of our time on that. But one thing that occurred to me as I was reading your bio is that one of the publications which I noticed right off is called Fragility of the World's Dream. And that was published in the Aranos yearbook, I think 2009 through 2011. I just think that title speaks so powerfully toward the crisis that we're facing on the planet right now. And so maybe as we launch, you could start just by talking about what prompted such a title for you and how you relate to that particular idea, the fragility of the world's dream.
Right. I think for me, there's one is a conceptual theoretical understanding. Yet there's something else that's going on that really touched my heart, touched my soul, that really pushed this whole idea forward. That is the fragility of the world, as we know, given climate change and environmental crisis of one kind or the next, really pushes itself upon kids in particular, youth, high school students, college students, and so on. And when I go into classes, and I'm asked to go into classes often, when I listen to dreams, more and more what I'm hearing in terms of dreams that are frightening or scary or somewhat intolerable is the earth, the idea that the earth has psyche, has soul, and that psyche, that soul is translated into something like a voice, and that voice moves itself through people's experience and translates into images in dream. And as the earth becomes increasingly fragile, so do people, in the sense that as we pick up that fragility in the world in terms of our own experience, then something else happens, which is difficult. So a lot of the experiences that I'm hearing from students in particular are linked right back to the fragility in the world, then being experienced through dream and really starting to really create some trouble internally and psychologically, emotionally for kids.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in fact, that's a topic that I think is really up for a lot of people, and especially in the field of depth psychology. And this is the whole idea of the psychology of climate change in particular, and also of the ecological crisis. In other words, what kinds of stresses and anxiety is it creating and producing among a group of people who have never really been so aware of the planetary changes and the social issues and the ecological issues that we're facing right now. I wonder if you can share a little bit about how, maybe you can sort of preface this by saying how you got interested in working with dreams, but also leading into how you feel that dreams can really serve to help us to take more of a depth psychological perspective, or to put it in a psychological context.
Yeah, I think I got interested in listening to dreams when I was a kid, actually. So, the origin story has to do with being on a beach, because I grew up here in California, and I was with a family vacation, and we were inhabiting one part of the ocean, one part of the beach, which was, very commercialized, big food signs and the rest. And then I decided to go on the other side of the peninsula there when the tide went out, and separate from all the other folks that were ordinarily there at the beach. I was alone, and there was a tide pool. I'll never forget to this day. At that tide pool, I was looking down into the water there, and a young man came by. It must have been like 17 or 18. I was about 12 or 13. And that 17 or 18-year-old boy, to me, at 12 or 13, was like a god. And what he said to me, I'll never forget. He said to me, do you know that rocks can talk? And I thought, I can't believe that just happened. Because I'm sitting there looking down and experiencing the aliveness, particularly of a tide pool. But all my childhood, I experienced trees talking, rocks talking, houses talking, and most kids do. Most kids in imaginal play are sensitive to the world as an animated entity. The animation of the world is very available and accessible to people, and particularly through dream. But of course, that's not verified, nor is that supported nor valued very much in traditional school or in our family experience or through our Western culture. So when he said that, and I was actually experiencing it at the same time, it was quite extraordinary. Of course, then the tide started coming in, and I walk around the point to the other side. My parents said, "Where were you?" And what was I going to say? Well, I just took a stroll down the ocean. However, where I really was in a place of appreciating that from a deeper place. Of course, I didn't use the word depth psychology at that point in time or anything. I just knew from a more genuine, authentic place, from that deeper sense of experience, rocks do talk. The world does speak. And dreams are an incredible vehicle to carry those voices.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I wonder, though, I think that all of us have some kind of an experience of this. Probably many can relate a story similar to that. And I love that it was rocks for you, because I also have a thing for rocks. And for me, there's just so much profound wisdom that they hold and that they carry. I often have a rock in my pocket. And it's kind of a way, I think, of just grounding myself into that understanding that there's something larger that's containing all of us. And I really love that as a touchstone. But in our culture, as you know, there's been such a movement away from this capacity to envision nature as being ensouled, to really understand on a day-to-day basis, let alone a minute-by-minute sort of presencing in which we are able to really feel into that and experience that as a reality. And many of us, and again, I'm speaking very broadly, but many of us have moved so far away from that we have forgotten it entirely or don't realize it. And this is what I think in so many levels is relating to what we call now the age of the Anthropocene, this whole idea that human beings have changed the entire face of the planet very profoundly and are continuing to do so. What do you think, Steve, is at the root of that issue? I mean, yes, we've forgotten that interconnectivity, but how do we begin to trace our steps back and either take another different path or be able to correct and somehow heal that forgetting that has occurred to us? Right.
Well, for me, there's a certain organicity that's at work always in the world of dream. I am so shaped by the behavior that I'm involved with day by day. Of course, I'm the president, chancellor of an institution. So I have a lot of daily tasks, from personnel matters to budget, to curriculum development, to faculty senates, to, outreach. The day is busy, and the day is filled with screen time and calendaring. And, I'm very plugged into lots of technological mechanisms like we all are. And so the question becomes how to get back to that kind of organic impulse, that place that essentially is birthed us from the beginning. And one way is to go out and take nature walks, right? And truly, I'm not sure even there, we come into that with a particular attitude. If we come into with the attitude of trying to work off calories or trying to figure out the next best thing, we're going to be in nature in one way. If on the other hand, we come into that nature space in a way that opens our hearts, opens our soul, we're responsive, receptive to, rather than reactive, I think something different happens. And still, most of us live in cities. So it's not a question of always being connected to the nature, per se. In fact, the cityscape sometimes is as aesthetic and as beautiful as a mountainscape in certain ways. It's a question of really tapping back into that essential soul spark that really is enlivened, and as you say, in an enchanted world. And one of the ways to get there is, in my mind, in my direct experience, and the hundreds of people that I'm connected with, is to listen back into the organicity of dream. Because dreams come each and every night, come during the night, come during the day, and they connect us to a certain cadence that I think is linked most essentially to the rhythms of nature and the natural world. Nature is going on all the time inside of us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just such a beautiful thought. And I think part of it too is being able to just slow down and think about or feel into just exactly such statements as you're saying right now. And it's true in such a busy world, and I can completely relate to some of the things you were mentioning. You know, we have our day-to-day lives. And so even if we're aware of this need to be able to consider ourselves as nature or take the nature walks, it's not always as easy to do. But it's true that the dream world opens something that is otherwise, I think, not as accessible, because everybody has dreams, everybody remembers dreams or can remember dreams, at least at some point in their lives. And to be able to tap into that and begin to start paying attention to those images that show up and the characters that are coming through and the voices that they have and what they're saying becomes a very unique and different thing. Like I said, it's almost like a portal, I guess, from the way that I look at it. And I know that you've done a lot of work with corporations and people who are busy and leading businesses and different kinds of organizations and are very maybe not as close to this whole idea of dreams. Of course, your dream tending process is very unique and has, I think, brought a lot of people around to a different kind of understanding. Can you share more? Do you have stories or can you share a little bit about what some of the results have been that you've managed to see when some of these people come around?
Yeah, I'm invited each year. In fact, we just calendared again more than one time. I'm invited to this place in Europe, in the Italian Alps. The question is, it's a gathering of multinational CEOs. So these folks really have enormous influence because they're running some of the bigger companies in the world, right? And now if I come in, and the first thing that I do not do is talk about psychology, right? I mean, you know, they're just not as interested, nor are they as schooled, nor is they, do they really give as much value to psychology. I mean, if I use the words depth psychology, or I'm working with the anima or with the self and depth psychological Jungian perspective, or on and on it goes, I lose interest immediately. On the other hand, when I share with people, you know, at night, when our eyes are closed, something else comes away. Simple as that. And we get curious. What is it that comes away? And what comes away sometimes are images, picture images that we experience most often as dream. Sometimes what comes away are feelings or experiences or colors or voices. You know, things come away. And then the question becomes not what does this mean? What do these voices mean? Which is where we always want to go so quickly. The move is not what does it mean? Rather, who's visiting and what's happening here? And that's the curiosity, I think, that opens up that incredible resource, this amazing intelligence that lives in the interior of our experience. And that's the way, I think, to get to dream and work with these folks. And I'll tell you that you asked for a story. Here's a great story. One of the things that happens that's different is I do a lot of work, as you mentioned in my bio, with United Nations and with, you know, with big policy formulating bodies, one sort of the next. I was just in Utah, in fact, working with city council and county government. You know, you're doing that kind of work, and it's important, and it's crucial, and it's critical, and I feel good about contributing the one part that I can contribute that's helpful. What's different, though, is it's a bureaucratic process. Of course it is. And therefore, you can work for years, particularly in the United Nations. We can work for decades, which we've been working for decades in terms of the Earth Charter. That's one way of going. Working with these multinational CEOs, we can spend 4 days together. 2 or 3 people in the room have incredible breakthroughs. They have an experience that really matters to them. They really re-experience the depth of their own humanity, and they appreciate how that humanity is connected to the psyche in nature, to the world soul, to the anima mundi, the Latin for world soul. They have an experience of that. They experience something about what they would call their life purpose, right? Their sense of calling. You know, those are the kinds of words that we use that work. The difference is that workshop can end on a Sunday afternoon. On Monday, when they go back into their corporate world, they can make 2 or 3 changes in their work setting, and thousands of people are affected. So it's very extraordinary when you work in that context to see how quickly things actually are able to shift and to change, right? If I'm connected to this kind of intelligence and I find that that is fulfilling for me, right? And I find that it animates not only me, but my relationship in the world, I'm then going to want to share that with people that are in my employ.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really profoundly important. And I just want to say, when I asked you that question, I noticed as you began to speak that I had used the term "these people." And I want to actually just qualify that on some level and include myself in that, because I worked in the corporate world also for many, many years. And so I think on some level, I'm tempted to sort of separate us out, because we are doing a different kind of work than, say, psychologists or other people, which has been much more my experience lately. But these people are really typical of, I think, everybody in the culture. And what you're saying about having the access to that kind of intelligence and being able to then spread that or share that forward in much the same way that you're talking about can become such a powerful way for new consciousness to arise, not only in individuals, but also in the entire society, among all of us who are so caught up in this sort of technological age or digital age in which we're really not able to slow us down. It's kind of an addiction on some level, I think.
Yes, it is. And I think really just practically the skill set is as simple as when a dream comes, right? Or when an experience that's out of the ordinary comes, rather than immediately going to what's familiar to us with good reason are 2 questions. What does this mean? What does this mean? Or why is this happening? So we're trained to go into our rational mind and to try to figure it out, right? One way of slowing down, as your suggestion, is to replace those 2 questions with who's visiting now, as I just mentioned. Who's visiting now? Not what does this mean? Who's visiting now? Who's actually showing up? And then the second question, what's happening here? Looking at the activity of what's going on. In other words, we do pause. We slow down, get curious, and activate that quality of our intelligence, our capability, and notice what's going on with the dream, with the imagery. What's happening? Who's visiting? And then one begins to develop a relationship with the entities, or what I call the living images, the figures of dream, rather than kind of going into an immediate interpretive or explanatory system. So the very first thing to do, just as simple as can be, slowing down, who's visiting now? What's happening here? Those central questions really shift the paradigm and bring us into a different quality of relationship with the figures of dream and also in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this isn't shifting gears really, but I think in some ways moving more fully into everything that we've just been talking about. And that is, I'd love to spend some time on the Global Dream Initiative. The Global Dream Initiative is a visionary project of yours. It's something that I think is extremely important. And as I mentioned, I think visionary, because there is so much capacity for those of us who are interested in dreams, who are interested in how the world can change or how we can be more participatory with the world around us. It's a prime opportunity for us to really be able to move more wholly into that and to deeply engage. So I'd love to hear more about your vision for it and a little bit about how it started as well.
Okay. The Global Dream Initiative started because of the advocacy, I guess, from the beginning. It's actually what Pacific Graduate Institute is rooted in, is this fantasy of the anima mundi calende gratia, for the sake of tending to the soul of and in the world, right? And to that extent, how does one listen to the psyche or the soul? And of course, the primary vehicle, as we're talking about, is dream. And the Global Dream Initiative is the possibility of hearing the creatures, the things, the landscapes in the world speak on behalf of themselves through the images of dreams, through the images that we experience in the dream time. course, this is as old as indigenous cultures, right? It's I spent time in Australia with Aboriginal elders, actually in Hawaii with Kahuna, Sagoma in Africa, called native people here in Santa Barbara, Chumash peoples. So these teachings suggest to us that if the world is animated, not if, as the world is animated, those figures or those experiences will show up in the imagery of dream. And if we begin to think in terms of those images in dream visiting, they're going to tell us something about the world condition. They're going to suggest to us ways that we might participate that would be on behalf of hopefully healing and tending to the world rather than being so split off and then what happens, exploitive of the world. So I think, the genesis of the Global Dream Initiative started there. It then gained traction when I started working with the United Nations. It's now in multiple countries. I just got back from Russia, from China, from the Philippines, which is way involved and engaged. We have people in Argentina and Brazil. People all over orient around the idea that the psyche speaks, the planet speaks through the imagery of dreams. If we can hear into that imagery, then we ask a different question. What is the planet asking of us, rather than how do we fix the planet? And that's the pivotal question. And the pivotal question is, what do we hear from the planet herself, itself, himself? What do we hear? What is the way forward, so to speak? And I think that is the Global Dream Initiative. Now people all over the country and internationally are listening to dream, not only from a personal perspective, but from a world perspective, hearing the stories and the images that I mentioned coming forward, putting them into montage, creating story, creating poetry, and like that. And then we take that information, that material, and feed that back into policy formation through the United Nations initiative on the Global Earth Charter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I have seen myself through some of the work that's been produced by the Global Dream Initiative is a lot of people that are recording and then working with those dream images that come forth. A lot of them are in the form of nature images. They don't have to be, of course, and any given dream could be, the voice of the earth or the psyche, without necessarily being a nature item or object or image. But I know that a lot of those dreams also do include and focus on animals. And of course, James Hillman, as we know, did a lot of work with dream animals and the meaning for them. And he said that, I remember a quote from him where he said he feels that animals can wake us up. They kind of bring us out of the usual place where we are, because they provoke our feelings and our emotions. Have you been finding that a lot of the dreams that you're hearing coming through the Global Dream Initiative and elsewhere are that animals are really beginning to emerge and to have a voice?
Well, yeah, animals for sure, because animals animate. It just comes from that same. They are animate creatures, and we in turn are animals. So we are part of the same clan, so to speak, in certain ways. And so when animals come into dream, Marie-Louise von Franz, a Jungian analyst working back in circuit, she wrote thousands of dreams, literally thousands, spent a lifetime working with dreams from this perspective. And she said at the end of her life, after working all these people, all these dreams, there's only one thing she found to be true in working with dream, because there's so many ways of working with dream. She said, but there is one thing that's true. When the animal shows up in a dream, you follow the animal. And the animal in the dream will take you to a place that is unknown, unfamiliar, and often very rewarding. And of course, it works. Everybody from following Lassie in the old days to E.T., right? Follow the animal, follow the white rabbit, and it'll take you to, as you said, a portal that something different and new will open up. So when animals come in dreams, I always stop there, encourage people to listen, but not make meaning. White rabbit equals something, the horse equals father, not that. But to get very curious about who's visiting now, which animal's here now, and how is this particular white rabbit different than any other white rabbit? Or how is this horse different than any other horse? Because to the extent that we see its particularity is the extent that it becomes embodied. In other words, it comes into the room, and we have the capacity to develop a kind of relationship with it. We get to know each other. We befriend or tend one another. And I think that's the key. Animals come, of course, in cultures, again, for thousands of years, animals come into dream time or into vision, and it's important. They become important companions. And so it is, you know, with imagination, an animal visits through dream, and we get to know and develop a relationship rather than interpreting it away so quickly, as I said, simply to slow down, develop a relationship, and we begin to host a companion that may be very valuable, to lead us to something that we don't know, share something that we haven't heard, open our animal body in ways that we haven't been open. So it's an emotional as well as psychological as well as activistic possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, so true. You know, everything that you're saying is making me think of something which I say often, and so probably a lot of people that are watching this right now have heard me say this before, but it's really an idea that struck me so profoundly that comes from another participant in this symposium, actually Jerome Bernstein, who's a Jungian analyst out of New Mexico. And hopefully most of you have watched that interview with him by now. But he talks a lot about how he believes that the earth or nature or that something larger is actually reaching out to us in a very reciprocal manner in order to bring us back from the brink of extinction, because we have made a lot of mistakes and we have started down this path that is very destructive and could be really so detrimental in so many ways, not just to the human race, but also to a lot of life forms on Earth. We're seeing it in the mass extinctions that are happening now. And so I'm wondering if you have seen patterns or if you can identify certain themes that are emerging from the dreams that are coming up in the work, and even in your own, you know, thinking and thought processes and feelings, if there are certain patterns where you can actually recognize that the earth is reaching out to help us and bring us back in partnership.
Yeah, for me, it's without question, right? The soul, the psyche of the things and the creatures and landscapes of the planet are certainly reaching out. I mean, you know, when extinction comes, we, in terms of our animal body, are particularly sensitive to, susceptible to that kind of reach, right? It's as if we have to reimagine or reframe our psychology. It's not that we project something onto the creatures and things of the world and make them part of ourselves. We have to appreciate that the world itself is projecting its interiority onto us, and we're hearing that and seeing that and experiencing that in dream. I can tell you, it's, you know, it's as extraordinary as it is heartbreaking and painful, right? To do this kind of work means, of course, that we're going to experience grief, because the plea of the world is to get our attention and to have us appreciate that things are really falling apart. And it's never more so than when I'm working with young people. They're permeable. First, they're listening to the body of science. You take kids that are in middle school or high school or undergraduate, they're already hearing the body of science that's suggesting that the world is not going to be the same and perhaps inhabitable in 20 years, 40 years from now. The planet as we know it simply will not be as it is. So they're hearing the science behind it. We're all familiar with the science behind it. They're now experiencing the actuality. And of course, we go into distraction and denial to keep that away, except when our eyes are closed, there's the capacity for that actuality to come forward and touch us in a deeper, more instinctual level. And it comes forward in the images of dreams. So yeah, to me, we're implicated by the world soul, by the dream of the world. And we're implicated in the way that the voices, the images of the world psyche are touching into our own dream time and saying, hey, hello, here we are. I gotta say though, you know, the way I'm talking almost makes it sound fanciful or almost at the edge of Disney-esque or esoteric. The actuality is not that at all. The actuality is that people will wake up in night terror or tremendous nightmarish or the intolerable. That's what breaks through. So the patterns that I'm experiencing more often have to do with I wake up and I feel startled, or I have some kind of nightmarish experience, or I feel something of the impossible touching me. You know, a big flood comes over me, or I find myself in an explosive experience of one sort or the next. And ordinarily what we would do with that would be to link that to early family experience or cultural themes. We don't link it necessarily to the idea that that's the planet itself speaking through us in the imagery of dream. So when I'm working with folks, I'll say to them, you know, notice your dreams and notice which dream image seems most peculiar, most odd, most out of the ordinary. How is that image at work? Because that's now working through the kind of conformity and kind of homogeneity of cultural tradition and that kind of shaping. And I'll say, and do you have any sense how that image that's coming forward that's so difficult, so hard to hold or to handle, how that is connected in some way to what's going on in the natural world? It may not all be our own, and that's what's relieving. When I'm in high schools, for example, I was just in a high school here in Santa Barbara, and kids will hear these nightmarish images and feel that there's something so wrong with them. And when you place the image not in their own psychology or in their collective experience, but notice that it may have something to do with what's going on here. For example, to make it concrete, we just had our first rains for, I would say a year, because we're in the middle of a drought here in Southern California. And the rains come, and the first thing that happens is the rains wash everything from the mountains and the streets into the sea, into the ocean here. Well, because we have been in rain for a while, of course, you can only imagine what gets washed in the sea. This happens every season. And when that happens, something else goes on. The oceans get very toxic. Of course they would. They get toxic because all the runoff goes in. Signs are posted along the sea, no swimming, keep out of the water. And people pick that up. I mean, we pick that up because the ocean itself is ill, is toxic. And that experience then gets sent through us, and people get depressed. They go into despair. But is it my despair? Is it because that there's something wrong with me, or because I'm under social pressure, or because of family of origin influence? Maybe yes, of course. And two, when the world is sick, we get sick. And so, that's the work that I think we have to do in terms of tending to the idea that the world itself is hurting and is ill and is reaching out to us and taking its claim on our attention.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what I notice in all of this is that I think it's easy sometimes to have a tendency to think or believe that when we begin to work with dreams and images and to engage, that we are simply going to get answers or solutions or wisdom in the way that we are traditionally sort of conditioned to expect it. And so the idea that you brought up, which is around the fact that we're all going to experience grief when this happens. I mean, how could we not? As we begin to open ourselves to what's actually happening on the planet and to the grief that the world itself feels, that the anima mundi itself is capable of, then we begin to understand that some of that has to be processed through our very human emotions as well. And in some ways, I think it almost is a cleansing of the toxicity that you mentioned that's in the oceans. It allows that sort of passing through of the grief and the emotion, and then hopefully maybe can bring us out to the other side. But it's important to mention that I think that this isn't necessarily a simple process. One has to be really interested in and committed to what's happening here, or at the very least open, because sometimes it doesn't happen because we go looking for it, right? I'm sure you've had that experience, and I know I have. Sometimes it happens to us because something bigger is reaching out to us and trying to wake us up and bring us into relationship.
And notice, if something is reaching out to us, one of the ways of finding some sense of some sense of ease is first, of course, to experience the despair and express oneself, like you're saying. But the second is, if something's reaching out to us, we reach back to it, right? Rather than interpreting it as a psychological pathology, which is what we're trained to do, which has its place. Believe me, I'm a clinical psychologist, so it has its place. In addition to that, though, we need to reach back to what's reaching to us. So if there's an image that suggests that, for example, in what I just shared, that the ocean is ill, and that comes into our awareness, and we feel that sadness, then what's the next step, right? The next step is, how do I take action and reach back out to do something in the world on behalf of that? Doesn't have to be grandiose. It doesn't have to be extraordinary or inflated. It can be very simple. But that concrete action of being activistic and reaching back somehow does seem to really support us in the work that we're doing and in our own sense of ease.
So, you've talked a lot about young people in this conversation, and I really appreciate that. In fact, it's kind of interesting because we started early on with you telling the story of when you were a very young person at age 12 or 13, and you really had this experience of understanding or being exposed to the idea that rocks could talk. And I think that that's something that is very much more accessible to us, obviously, as young people. And as we get older, it becomes harder and harder to conceive of that and to fathom it. And yet we know that our young people are the ones that are bearing a lot of the brunt of what's happening here. As Joanna Macy said, an activist and a Buddhist scholar, she said that, maybe for the first time in the history of the world, we are aware as a culture and a society that we are in danger of possibly destroying ourselves. And so carrying this kind of knowledge, and I'm paraphrasing, so my word's not hers, but it really struck me when I heard or read that for the first time from her, that this is a huge burden for us to carry, and particularly for our young people who know that they have their whole lives ahead of them and that they are this coming generation who's going to have to deal with a lot of the fallout from some of these things that have happened to us. And one thing that Hillman said that really strikes me is he said, dreams recover what the world forgets. And so I'm wondering if you can sort of give us your interpretation of what Hillman meant by that, and maybe particularly in relationship to these young people who are carrying this burden.
Well, let me go back to Joanna Macy for a moment. Joanna also said, and this is also painful, right? She says that, it's as if the death of the planet is being grieved in the dreams of our children. And, it hurts, and there's some truth there that as the planet is moving towards a certainty of certainly something different than what is now, there's going to be grief, and the young people are permeable still, and they're picking that grief up. The world, I think, is always dreaming, and I think that to the extent that we have ears that are open and imaginations that are receptive, that we can hear that problem or that pathos in the world as it moves through us and through our experience. And in that way, we are remembering. We're remembering something of what those natural rhythms in the world have to offer, frankly. So many of the animals are, 90% of the big fish in the ocean's gone now, right? And you could just go right through the list, which I won't do at the moment, but one species after the next going extinct. So as they go extinct, where are they remembered? How are they remembered? And frankly, one of the places that they're remembered is in the dream time. So as an animal, as we mentioned earlier, comes forward, we're hearing that animal. It has a life of its own. It's moving through imagination, through the psyche, to the extent that we get reconnected. And remember, the way that I see that is reconnected through a relational experience, not through an identification, an interpretation, or an analysis of the animal. But as we reconnect in a living relationship, we do bring a sense of remembrance as to what the world has to offer to us personally and collectively. Of course, artists know this for sure. When people are doing art, something's moving through them from another place and it's expressed, right? When people are making music, the music is often sourced from a different place. When people are engineering, I just got finished working with a group in Silicon Valley. These are extraordinary young people, and the generation above that are doing amazing things in technology, and they're being sourced. I mean, the innovation, the creativity, the ingenuity is off the charts, right? Where is that source coming from? It's coming from an imaginal presence, and yet they're hungry. Those folks that I was invited to work with, they're hungry because they're saying, look, I've got all this stuff going on in my mind. I'm really working in teams and we're powering through as best we can. And yet, where is the well that this is coming from, and how can I go deeper into that well? How can I reconnect to the source, that source in me, which I believe is in the world soul, the world psyche, anima mundi? How can I reconnect to that place to keep the juice moving, to keep myself active and engaged, and also slow down enough to reconnect with who I am in the middle of all this? So there's a kind of remembering that's going on all the time in that context.
That's beautiful. And it's very delicate work. It's not obviously a given, but I think the more that we're able to tap into that thing, the more it becomes apparent and obvious to us. So I hope that everybody out there is writing down their dreams and really starting to pay attention to those if you're not already. Steve, as we wrap up here, I just wanted to close us out a bit with a quote that you actually wrote. It comes from your writing, and it says, "Nature is always dreaming, unfolding herself in each moment. We also dream, each day imagining ourselves into our own inner nature. In the meeting place between natures, a window opens and we are deeply touched. We remember for a time our psychic inheritance, an endowment rooted most essentially in the rhythms of nature." I don't know if you can say it better than that. That's just really beautiful. And for me, that so encapsulates all of this. And that is that dream work can be used for the individual, but it can also be such an amazing vehicle and a tool for us to be able to tap into what's happening on a collective level, into the anima mundi, as you mentioned. So I'm really grateful for your work that you've been doing toward all of this.
Oh, thank you, Bonnie. Yeah, that's nice to hear. And it's a privilege to have the conversation with you.
I appreciate it. You can learn more about Steve's work at dreamtending.com, and you can also find out more about the Global Dream Initiative, which is a growing vision, as we mentioned, and that's at globaldreaminitiative.com. And of course, I've been speaking with Steve Aizenstat, who is the Chancellor and founding president of Pacifica Graduate Institute and the author of Dream Tending, among other works. Thank you so much for being with me today, Steve.
You're welcome. Thank you, Bonnie.
For more information, visit www.depthpsychologyalliance.com.